Hey there, I'm Jordan and welcome back to the channel. This channel is all about filmmaking techniques, the philosophy of art, creative and technical workflows, and what filmmaking can teach us about life. This is the fourth part in the multi-part video case study series on the making of my short film, Cuddle Buddies, that I wrote, directed, edited, and produced. The first part in the series covered the writing of the script, the second part covered the pre-production and planning phase, and the third part covered the production and shooting of the film. So I highly recommend checking out all three of those before we dive into today's discussion, which covers the post-production and editing phase for the film. I will outline my process and what works for me for my post workflow, but I also want to emphasize that this is not the end-all be-all of post pipelines, and there might be much better, more formal or official pipelines, especially on bigger projects. So if you have any of those, I would love to hear. Maybe you could even help me fix what's not working in my post workflows, but just want to start by emphasizing that before we get further. So what is Cuddle Buddies? The logline is as follows. Cuddle Buddies tells the story of Lucy, a single mother who works as a professional cuddler in order to support her young daughter Marina and to alleviate the loneliness not only in her clients, but also in herself. Completing production. We wrapped the 3-day shoot for Cuddle Buddies at the very end of June of 2019. There certainly have been projects where the deadline is much tighter just due to certain restraints. But a lot of times if I'm creating my own projects and I have my own timeline, I really like to build in a couple week period to take a little break from thinking about the project at all. This really gives me a chance to not only recharge, but also when I come back to the project, I have a much better mental objectivity and clarity on the project when I really do decide to start to go into the edit. So I really give myself that chance to tinker, experiment, and excavate every option of what I could do with that footage as possible. Part 1, logging the footage. Logging the footage or watching and organizing every clip is oftentimes a very tedious and time-consuming process, but is very essential since you're able to uncover every element, every nuance, every performance, and really see what kinds of footage you're working with and how you might be able to start to piece it together in the edit. It's thrilling when you notice subtle nuances in actor performances or amazing camera movements or rhythms that all came together that you didn't quite notice on the shoot. But by that same token, it's also gut-wrenching when you realize maybe you didn't quite ever get one solid take, or you didn't capture the necessary footage you need to help piece it together in the edit as smoothly as you would like. The good news is with clever editing and problem solving and the recent advances in technology and visual effects, there usually is always some sort of solution that you can do, even if you have to do it digitally and fix it in post, which is always the adage of don't lean on fixing it in post. But these days, there are so many great softwares and technologies that oftentimes you really can fix a lot of the more subtle problems that you have with your footage in post if you need to. Though if you do go with some of these post or visual effects fixes, this usually always incurs additional costs. So if you have that, it's all good. But if you don't have in your budget, you might just have to get even more creative in your problem solving. As the writer and director, if I'm editing the project myself, it can be a great thing since it really allows you to protect the integrity and the real creative spirit of the film all the way through to the finish line, especially since if you were the first person to really author that idea, you really understand what it needs to be from its very inception. But a major thing that's crucial if you're editing a film you directed yourself is to make sure to show the film and subsequent cuts to trusted colleagues and filmmakers along the way, just so you can get an objective viewpoint. Part 2, the logging process. When I'm logging the clips, it can be very tedious because I watch every single clip from start to finish. And oftentimes I'll do this multiple times for every clip on every card that we recorded for the whole project. But I think the key here is to really space this out. Take your time when logging. Don't leave it all just for one day, since you really will start to lose that ability to judge clips objectively and have that stamina to make it through every single clip and watch it from start to finish. Oftentimes I'll schedule just looking at 1 to 2 cards worth of footage at one time. This way I can watch every clip with full attention and make sure that the clips I'm picking as my selects are actually the ones that I think are the best takes from that bunch. If over a series of days you still feel strongly about certain clips over others as your selects, then you can objectively know that these clips probably are the best of the bunch from what you have to work with. Editing is all about organization. If you have a good system of labeling and organizing certain folders and where to find them quickly, That'll not only allow you to move much quicker, but I promise it'll be a much more enjoyable post process if you do so. I begin by starting a project file on a non-linear editing system. The most popular of those is Premiere or DaVinci Resolve. There's also Avid. Personally, my editing system of choice has become DaVinci Resolve from Blackmagic Design. I just think it has very good options for transcoding and color grading and is a very powerful system, and best of all, it's free. However, we used Adobe Premiere Pro to edit this film since at the time, a couple years ago, that was still my preferred editing system of choice. What this meant is we had to do what they call a round trip workflow, where we generated all of the editing within Premiere, and then we had to send it out to a different program, which was DaVinci Resolve, to do our final color grading. But I think in hindsight, had we have stayed in DaVinci the whole time and just used one software, I really think it would have made our post workflow that much more streamlined. Once I start a new project in the editing software, I like to create a master timeline where I will sync every single video and audio clip, and that also becomes the first string out of all the clips in one space, where I can start to label my select takes, I can start to label my second and thirds, I can definitely weed out clips that aren't working, and I can also label each scene by its own respective color. So for example, the first scene in the film, I'll probably color code every clip in that scene to be green, and the second scene might be yellow, and then the third scene might be purple, etc. For an example of my master timeline with the color coding schema, I will put a photo at the link in the description below so you can check out what some of my timeline examples looked like. It's also very helpful to label each clip with its respective scene and take number. So for example, the first shot would be scene 1, second setup would be scene 1A, etc. If you do this, it makes your organization so much faster to find whatever clips you need. And oftentimes a lot of these editing systems have search functions that allow you to search and find clips very rapidly if you labeled them properly. Part 3, organizing the first cut. Once every clip from every scene is labeled and color coded, then I really like to sit down and watch every clip in that scene from start to finish to really find out what are my select takes that I want to use to act as the building blocks for the very first rough cut. I really prefer to only tackle viewing one scene at a time per sitting, since this really helps avoid eye fatigue, but it allows you to pick the best takes with the most mental clarity as possible. Key takeaway number 1. For me, if I'm working on the edit for a project that I did by myself, I really find it crucial to build in that time to only edit and work on the project in specific chunks of time to really avoid that burnout. Keep yourself motivated, keep yourself focused and excited about the project, especially because if you don't have a massive team to help you log the footage like you would on a bigger show or feature film, this really can be a very grueling process. So my advice is really to take your time, only do a little bit at a time, unless you have a really crazy deadline. Build in that time to your post timeline so that you can really make sure you're picking the best moments, you're taking your time, you're letting time show you if there are better solutions to problems that you thought were insurmountable. So time really can be your best asset, especially if you're working with a very small post team or a team of 1 on any of your own projects. Part 4, editing scene by scene. Once your master timeline is all synced up and color coded, the next step I like to do is to create a subsequence or its own timeline for every scene within the film from the master timeline. So what I like to do is duplicate the master timeline and then only keep the clips from that specific scene on that timeline and delete every other clip around it, so that each scene in the film has its own timeline with clips that are only from that respective scene. This makes it really easy to just work on one scene at a time, isolate the clips, not get too overwhelmed as you go, and really just edit scene by scene and make the workflow that much more digestible when you only have 20 clips versus 300 clips to look at. When logging each scene, I really like to look at my top 1 or 2 takes from every camera angle or setup and color code that, usually in yellow, This allows me, when I go back through to review a second time, to really decide if I do want that to be the take for that scene or if there's a better one I should keep looking for. Once I have picked all of my top selects from every camera angle for that scene, I'll usually move all the other unused clips to the very far right of the timeline, just in case I still need to grab something from there later. And then I put together all the selects into the very front of the timeline to build the very first rough cut of what will be that scene. It's very important here that I don't get too nitpicky at this stage. I just want to get a workable version of that scene that I can ultimately plug into the first cut timeline that I'll build a little bit later on. There's going to be plenty of time later to do the very nitpicky cuts, so I think it's important to keep your momentum going and not to get too lost in the weeds at this point. So I like to go scene by scene until I have at least a rough version of every scene in the film cut together. Oftentimes, I will start with the shortest scenes first. Sometimes just getting one or two of those scenes edited to get you going is the best way to build that momentum to really finish the rest of this edit. Part 5. The first full rough cut. Upon completion of editing every scene in its rough form, the next stage is to create another timeline that I'll usually label as rough cut V1. And then I take all of the scenes edited in their rough form, I'll copy those clips, paste them all into this new timeline, and then I put them all together, which ends up becoming the very first iteration of your film in the roughest form that you'll see for the first time, which is equal parts terrifying and also equal parts exhilarating. At this point, I'll take note of how long the runtime is, and most of the time I'm completely shocked at how unbelievably long and way over runtime this first cut is. But don't worry, this is very normal. The first cut of Cuddle Buddies came in at a whopping 30 minutes long, and the final cut that you see now is closer to 16 minutes. So the good news is over half that film got trimmed, and they were all things that absolutely needed to go. After putting it all together for the very first time for the first rough cut, I really try to hit play, let it play out, and completely watch it almost as an objective viewer for the first time ever, as if I'm an audience in a theater. This is the best way to see how the feeling of the film comes together. And though there are things you're definitely going to fix, it's a really good way to see what's a preview of what this film is ultimately going to look and feel like in the final cut. Flaws and all, this is an extremely exhilarating moment since it's the first time you're really seeing the shape of your film. Part 6. The second cut and beyond. After that first cut is complete, again, I like to spend a little time away from the film and give it at least a couple days, and then I like to come back in, review it again, and this is now where you're really starting to have an eye for detail and subtlety and nuance, and really where you can start to trim down all of the things that are not absolutely necessary to the final cut. Feedback from colleagues. Generally for me, I wait until closer to the third or fourth cut to send out the cut to trusted colleagues, other filmmakers, other people in the industry, or other people that you just trust. This is such an essential part of the process to get other people's objective feedback who really can watch it more like a traditional audience and point out the things that weren't working for them, things that were, places you could cut, even ideas of what you could do for the next cut that you never would have thought of. And sometimes you just need to be pointed out to you from someone else who's really looking at it with the objectivity of not having been attached to the project from the very beginning. I often send the film to only a select group of people that are trusted colleagues who I know will know how to give good constructive feedback that can be harsh but also very helpful, and notes that I can actually implement at this stage of the process. It's not very helpful if you give notes that are saying things like you need to reshoot the scene or this whole thing's not even working, because those are things that you can't really change at this stage without a lot of time and money that you most likely don't have. My rule of thumb is to never assume that anyone will watch a cut of yours more than once, sometimes not even once. So make sure to not demand too much time of your colleagues that are watching this, since they might only watch it once, and if they do, you want to make sure that what you're presenting to them is in the best state it can be, since you might only get their feedback on one iteration of it. Sometimes some of the notes you'll get just aren't possible with the footage that you have, and that's also okay as well. But I think doing the best you can with the footage you have is the task of every filmmaker ever. Another note that I want to stress, especially if you're editing a film you wrote and directed, is that at the end of the day, you are the ultimate creator and author of this project, so you don't have to take every note that someone gives you. Sometimes certain notes are well-intended, they just aren't in the spirit of the film that you're making, and it would change the film in a way that is not what the film is that you're trying to make. I'll give a quick anecdote for some feedback that I received when I was working through revisions on Cuddle Buddies. This one was tough because at the time, I was not as experienced as a filmmaker. I really thought I had to try to take in every note and incorporate it from all of the colleagues, especially people who were much higher up the ladder than I was and that I really respected. And there was a trusted colleague I had who I showed the cut. I remember where we jumped on a call and he gave me feedback about Cuddle Buddies, and he was very generous to give me an hour of his time to watch the film. And all of the notes he gave were extremely interesting notes. But after a few days, I decided this was not at all in line with the spirit of the film I was making. He told me I should cut out a whole half of the beginning, lose the family drama, lose a lot of the stakes with losing the daughter, and really just focus on the intersection of cuddling being a place where that's only usually reserved for lovers, but in this context it's not, which would have lost all the narrative around the cuddling, which was the film I was trying to make. So in that way, I had to leave a lot of those notes to the side. Otherwise, I knew we wouldn't care as much about Lucy's plight, her stakes, her drama, and we wouldn't endear ourselves to her quite as much. And I knew that that was something that was going to sacrifice too much narrative interest, so I left it. Key takeaway number 2, know when to incorporate feedback and when to not incorporate it. Sit on the feedback for a couple days to a week and really decide if it's feedback that's actually going to ultimately benefit your film and serve the film you're making, or it's not. And if it's not, don't be afraid to leave it. Part 7, working with another editor. A little before we had shot the film, I ended up connecting with a fellow filmmaker named Anderson Seal through Facebook, and we had some great conversations on the phone about the film itself. And initially we talked about Anderson potentially producing the film, but when the timing didn't work out, he expressed interest in still being a part of the project, albeit in a little more of an editorial capacity. So fast forward to a couple months later after we had shot the film, and I reconnected with Anderson and asked him if he would still be interested in providing some editing assistance on the film, since at that point I was starting to realize I couldn't do it all completely by myself, and that was the best decision that we could have made for this post process. At the point I reached out to Anderson, I had completed the first few rough edits of the film, and we generated a workflow where we were able to pass back and forth the Premiere project file. And this was such a great way for him to work on certain passes of the edit, focusing on very specific things like the editing rhythm, continuity, making things even tighter, and even just suggesting different ways to cut scenes. This became a very essential phase to the rest of the breakthroughs that were to come. Part 8, major editing breakthroughs. This is the part where I will continually sing Anderson's praises, and it totally emphasizes how important it was to have that objective viewpoint. Breakthrough number 1. Early on in early edits of the film, I really followed the script verbatim as far as the structure and the order of the scenes, and very much felt like I had to follow that, mainly because I also wrote the film and directed it. We had a scene in the film where Lucy is on the phone with her divorce lawyer talking about the divorce from the ex-husband James, and the lawyer that you assume on the other end of the phone tells Lucy that she's about to lose full custody to James because of how he's positing her work in a court of law. We see the full emotion of her rage, but we also get a very good sense of what's at stake here with Lucy potentially losing her daughter. In the script, that was the second to last scene in the film, and it also ended up being the second to last scene in the early edits of the film as well. So Anderson suggested, why don't we swap it to be the third scene in the film so that much earlier on in the film, we get a very good sense of what the stakes are. And then the rest of the story, we already now know the stakes and are fully invested, even more so in a way than we would have been if we kept the original structure. The swap on the timeline took maybe 5 minutes, and immediately as soon as I watched it with the new structure, I knew this was so much stronger. This was such an elegant solution that was so quick and easy, yet something I never probably would have done on my own, since I was so attached to what the structure had been, because it had been ingrained into my head for so many years at this point, even from a script standpoint. Breakthrough number 2. At the time when we were editing the film, Anderson had recently watched the remake of Green Hornet, and there's a whole section in the scene that's an action sequence where there are multiple split screens being drawn. Once we had talked about the film, he suggested the wild idea of why don't we bring in some of those split screens into the client cuddle session scenes. I'll admit that when he first suggested the idea of the split screens, I couldn't really wrap my head around it, and it took me a little while to picture it. But after a couple days of really thinking on it, it all hit me like a light bulb moment. This had to be something we had to do with these scenes. This was a creative way to showcase a lot more of the cuddling sessions on screen, but it also was a much quicker way to truncate a lot of that long cuddle montage between the two different clients and to bridge the gap between those two scenes, and also add a lot more experimental visuals and creative flair to the film and really make it stand out in a way that a lot of short films don't incorporate into their editing. As unique as the subject matter was of professional cuddling, it became crystal clear to me at that moment that the editing had to be just as unique. I also really wanted to showcase for viewers that I was willing to go above and beyond to make a film that you really couldn't put in a box, so to speak. Ultimately, we settled on 4 frames since that felt like the most elegant collage of different shots on screen at the same time, in the most artistic capacity without overwhelming and going too overboard with the experimentalism. This film was always rooted in a spirit of experimental visuals paired with a family drama and a divorce story. We experimented with different versions of animating the frames and the direction of them and different comic book styles, and ultimately Anderson was able to animate the frames within Premiere and build out a different way that they drew on the screen when they were supposed to at specific intervals. It gave it such a distinctive character that I think a lot of people still talk about every time I've shown them this film. Ultimately, this ended up being my favorite section in the entire film because it was born out of just pure experimental creativity and excavation in the edit, and was never something that we had ever planned in the script phase. So it just goes to show how powerful the tool of editing really is. Take a look at this final split screen section as it appears in the final film.
This is called oxytocin hug. This is called hug boat. This is lap of luxury. Will you hold me? Yeah.
I will also put a link to the scene in the description below so you can check out exactly how he ended up animating this frame along with some reference photos of the timeline. One last breakthrough. As we approached our later edits, we still had a bloated runtime of around 20 minutes, and I really knew that my target runtime was always around 15 minutes and nothing more than that if I could help it. It became clear after looking at the film that the 2 longest scenes were the 2 client cuddle scenes between Lucy and Fiona and Lucy and Jeffrey. So another one of the big breakthroughs that I ultimately realized was we had to combine both of those client scenes to be a much longer cuddle montage, I called it. And in this way, we were able to really truncate both scenes, but still keep them in the film. This idea really allowed us to cut down on the overall runtime, but the other element that it was helpful for was it really cut down on the repetitive dialogue and the protocols that Lucy outlines for each client. We realized the audience would understand after one cuddle session how it works, and we really didn't need to bash it over their head again, since this would just serve to bloat the runtime without adding any new information into the equation. Key takeaway number 3. So much of editing really just comes down to problem solving and narrative economy. That concludes our first part on the 4th installment on the making of my short film, Cuddle Buddies. I definitely want to hear if you have any other comments or questions on post-production, or if you do it any differently. I'd love to hear your comments below. Every week, I'll recommend something that really inspired me from the past week and why. This week, I am very late to the game, but I finally got a chance to see the movie The Iron Claw, starring Zac Efron. It's written and directed by Sean Durkin, and holy cow, I can't even emphasize enough how much this movie completely blew me away. The movie is absolutely devastating in terms of the tragedy of what struck this family. And it's all based off the real story of the Von Erich wrestling family. What I was so taken with was how specific and realistic they made this film feel like. It really felt like you were watching something that was shot in the 1970s in Texas. And it's just a perfect example of how great filmmaking does not have to be visually flashy or over the top. It really can do so much with just a great story and characters that we really care about. I loved Iron Claw so much, it's now in my top 10 films of all time. I'd love to hear any other recs of any other kind that any of you all have, so hit me with yours. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you want to continue on this journey with me, then don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, leave a comment below, and turn on notifications so that you don't miss out on any of the excitement that's to come. And let me know what you want to see in a future video, and I'll make sure that it gets covered. Thank you for tuning in, and I will definitely catch you next week where we cover the second part of post-production on the making of my short film Cuddle Buddies. I'll definitely see you then.